This is our final panel this evening, and we've got two great speakers. We've got Lisa Cantillon, who's the CEO of KTA Tax, and she's a tax expert with extensive experience advising high net worth individuals. And we've Brian Kelly, who's the head of tax at Fitzgerald Power. He worked with the Big Four for 13 years before he was promoted to work in Fitzgerald Power as head of tax. Thank you very much, Brian and Lisa, for joining us this evening. And Brian, maybe just initially, could we just talk a little bit about exits and tax strategies for business owners? Can you tell me a little bit about what are the CGT reliefs that are available?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I suppose there's three main tax reliefs that we talk to investors about all the time. The first two reliefs, retirement relief and entrepreneurs relief, apply to individuals when they come to sell shares. So retirement relief applies for individuals aged over 55. The first 750,000 of the proceeds on the sale to a third party, you can be relief or exempt from capital gains tax. Once it goes over that, then marginal relief may apply. For individuals aged over the age of 70, the threshold is reduced to $500,000. There is an increased threshold which applies on transfers of businesses to children, and that's 10 million if you're aged between 55 and 70, and 3 million if you're aged over 70. The second relief we talk is about entrepreneurs relief. That provides for the lifeline threshold of 1.5 million, which is increased in the budget last week. So that should be effective from next year. That can be taxed. The first 1.5 million of the capital gain can be taxed at a tax rate of 10%. So that's potentially a saving of up close to 350,000 for an individual. And the balance over that is taxed at 33%. The third relief that we talked to them about is the participation exemption or the holding company exemption. And that applies to a company on the sale of shares. So say a holding company selling shares in a subsidiary. That provides for a complete exemption from capital gains tax where it sells the shares. So it provides, a company, it can retain the gross proceeds and it's useful if they want to make further investments or for tax planning later down the line, for example, if they want to go non-resident.
And Brian, how often do you think that owners need to review things? And does international expansion, does that complicate things? If you bought a business overseas?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at the survey that was done for Strategy 360. In that it showed that 61% of businesses plan to exit in the next 5 years. However, only 1 in 3 have actually looked at their exit plan. And of that, only 1 in 2 have actually looked at it in the last 2 years. So, it's important for businesses to be aware of what their exit strategy is, because if they don't, there's a lot of value that they can leave on table, particularly for plans which are out of date and don't keep aligned with current legislation. So, for those 2 out of 3 businesses that haven't a tax exit plan in place, I think the question is, when do you actually look at it? And, it reminds me of the old phrase, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So, if it isn't something you have looked at, it is a valuable investment to get some, at least high-level tax advice, just so you have some options around in exit in the future. And once you do have a plan in place, I think we recommend that it be reviewed at least every 2 to 3 years, or else when you have any milestone events in mind. So as you say yourself, Tom, when you're looking to structure overseas, if you're making investments abroad, other events, is when you're raising finance, when maybe the business is changing, there's changes in tax legislation. So anytime there's a milestone event, it's always worthwhile just having a look at your tax plan.
And Lisa, after all is said and done, when you've got the corporate structuring correct, and you might have created value, but it's down in your holding company. Do you have any advice in terms of getting it out of there?
God, as a tax advisor, that's a really interesting question, because the answer is the whole idea for the structure is that the value stays there. So we wouldn't necessarily be talking about accessing value immediately. And the reason is because the whole structure is about, and I think, Stuart talked about it earlier about, keeping as much value in your structure as you possibly can, because the ultimate tax plan with a holding company structure is that you invest it well, like you've discussed, access lower corporation tax rates for the investment, and then ultimately it passes to the spouse completely tax-free, free of capital gains tax and free of inheritance tax. So it's like a magic tax tool in terms of not being able to access value. If it has to pass to the children, then fine, there's an inheritance tax charge of 33%, but it's one tax hit. So the structure for a holding company is don't access it. That's the whole idea. But look, like it really depends on values as well. I mean, that's really key, because sometimes people might, we've listened to the experts today in terms about, how to maximize value. And sometimes people get more than they're expecting and they want to access some value. So if that does become an issue, how do we do that? And how do we do it tax efficiently? And again, it depends who we're accessing value for. Is it for the owners or is it for the owner's children? Because they're two different questions. But ultimately, I suppose a lot of the questions come around property. People want to buy a new house, they want to buy a new family home, they want to buy a home for the child. It's always around property. So maybe three things around that is that there are particular ways to be able to use a corporate structure to be able to buy a family home with a particular loan process that's documented well, and it's able to access a lower tax rate, a lower BIK rate to be able to do that. You need a good lawyer and a good tax advisor to do that. Another way of doing it is to maybe sell some assets into the holding company to create some liquidity for yourself personally. But again, that needs to be carefully considered, because not every asset is appropriate for that purpose. And then lastly, sometimes growth shares can be a good way to introduce value to the next generation. And introduced at the right time, right after a liquidity event, is a good time. But here's the point on growth shares, because growth shares they're kind of a thing now, weren't they? Like everybody's, I'd like growth shares, let's do some growth shares. But the thing with growth shares is that what is the aim? What are we trying to do with growth shares? If we're trying to pass value to the children in their lifetime, then it's probably appropriate. But if we're trying to pass value to the children after the parents have gone, then growth shares are not right, because once you collapse the structure, everybody has tax, and that's not very efficient. But I suppose just to round the circle on your question, I mean, the most simplest thing with a corporate structure is try and keep it there, because it's the most tax efficient way to pass it on.
And Brian, in terms of like owners and founders, like they can't get there without people around them. In terms of incentivizing management teams, what structures should you think about if you're trying to motivate your team, or you're thinking about an exit in 3 or 4 years' time and you want to make sure that they're rewarded?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a couple of things. I suppose one is the labour market is getting tighter, so it is becoming more competitive to recruit the right talent. They all, when we do management incentive plans, it's important to align the rewards for the employees along with the strategic objectives of the company, and make sure that everything is in line and everyone is heading in the same direction. I suppose there's a couple of different plans that we look for when we are doing designing management incentive plans. Cash bonuses are obviously they're very straightforward and easy to understand, but they do suffer from high income tax rates. Another alternative would be to have phantom shares. So they mimic an actual share, but they don't actually dilute the share ownership. So it provides for a cash payout to the employees once either certain hurdles are achieved or there's an exit event. But again, they can be easier to administer, but again, they suffer from high income tax rates. The third option would be to, give real equity participation to the management team. That can provide, it's a really powerful tool to incentivize management. They really have skin in the game at that stage. But, as Lisa was saying, growth shares is the new vogue, what we're talking a lot about. Which, for a management team, it's really, it is a great incentive. And I suppose it preserves the existing shareholders' value of what has been created. So I suppose the management team only get to participate in the future growth of the company. And it can be efficient for management teams to get in because they're acquiring shares at market value, and generally market value is low given just the performance hurdles that have to be satisfied before value does come in those shares. And then I think the third option is share option schemes. Everyone understands share option schemes and what they're about. I suppose the one which has recently come in is the KEEP scheme, which the government introduced a few years ago and extended again in the budget last week. They are a great tool, for the management team in that they suffer CDT on the exit, but they don't have that income tax charge when they exercise the shares. But the problem with the KEEP scheme, KEEP's shares, is that, the conditions which you have to satisfy are complicated, and the uptake, as a result of that, the uptake of it has been low. So I suppose when management teams are looking at implementing a management incentive plan, they need to consider just the vesting schedules, just the performance hurdles, and just where they are in their growth cycle, and is it right for them. So I think getting legal and tax advice early in the process is key, just to make sure you're compliant, just to make sure it's tax efficient, and just to make sure you don't have any undue complications.
And Brian and Lisa, or like in terms of mistakes that you see, either by SMEs or individuals, are there any particularly glaring ones that you see made by either people or companies just before they exit?
Yeah, I think, going back to, I think it was Niamh had mentioned it earlier that, finance is often the last thing on people's mind. I think the same can be said for tax. I think SME owners underestimate the time it takes and the complications that arise with putting in place an effective tax plan. There is often, with the release I mentioned earlier, there is often conditions around how long you have held shares and what is related to that. So, give you a couple of examples. If you want to insert a holding company into your structure, you'll often rely on stamp duty relief, but there is a clawback period of 2 years if you break that group structure within 2 years. For the participation exemption, then you have to hold the shares for 12 months. For income tax planning, you can transfer shares between spouses, but I suppose that can eat into your release. If that's done over the age of 55, it can reduce your threshold for retirement relief. So, while it is beneficial to transfer shares between spouses, particularly if both work in the same business, you can get 2 hits of retirement relief or 2 hits of entrepreneurs relief. Timing around when that is done, and for entrepreneurs relief, typically both spouses will need to meet a 3-year shareholding ownership period. So it's something that you can put in place at the last minute. It's something to consider around timing. Getting early advice is key.
And Lisa, when you're giving advice around estate planning, what are the sort of things that you're saying?
Well, I suppose the estate planning is kind of really interesting because it starts almost with, has somebody got a will? All right, I know it seems like a basic thing, but having an up-to-date will is probably the most important thing that somebody could have. And sometimes having no will is better than a really old will, because the old wills sometimes can be not fit for purpose for family circumstances and children, etc. So that's kind of quite important. But ultimately, when it comes to estate planning, what we really like is tax-efficient wills. And there's something that is not rocket science. They're pretty easy to put in place. You get a brief from a client, the tax advisor is able to brief the solicitor. And there's some really nice, wills that you can do with trusts and will disclaimer clauses and things that don't make the tax disappear, but it puts it into a warehouse, the assets, for a period of time, gives the beneficiaries a bit of breathing space to see, can we access the relief? Can we maybe skip a generation? Because I think that's getting quite common now in terms of the wealth that people have today. And so a will can do all of that. And it's not something that a client has to do in their lifetime, when you're selling a business or accessing a relief, for restructuring. There's huge amounts of work involved. But with a will, you can do it, it can be done in 1 week, on all the estate planning, be done in that. And it really translates well to the next generation.
And Lisa, what are the trends that you're seeing? Like, in terms of, is there new things coming down the tracks in terms of estate planning that you're seeing your clients begin to ask about, or that you're telling them about?
Yeah, like there is, and what's, I kind of touched on it there, like what's really, really new is there's this first generational wealth. It's kind of crazy. So in that context, there's a few aspects. There's like parents are really concerned about the wealth that their children are going to get. There's financial literacy piece, there's like how are they going to cope, all that kind of stuff. And therefore, your kind of trusts and stuff like that deal with some of that stuff really well. But another thing that's really common right now is because of the scale of wealth of clients, the kind of scale of their assets, both Irish and international scope of their assets is huge. So like I'm finding myself on a daily basis dealing with foreign tax advisors in different jurisdictions all over the world. And you don't need to know the answer, but you got to know where to find it for clients. Yeah. And you got to be able to deliver something in a combined way. And that's new. I mean, that used to happen, not, fine, it happened once in a blue moon, but that's happening weekly now, where you're having to deal with international issues and finding solutions for clients.
And Brian, would you like to respond to Lisa, or maybe talk about something that you see that's new and coming down the tracks? Do you think people should be aware of?
Yeah, I suppose it's a topic we could talk about all night, but there's a couple of things I'd like to see coming down the tracks. The government have talked about simplifying the tax system, from a corporate tax head perspective on, like, when I started in tax about 20 years ago, the corporation tax return was about 20 pages. It's up to about 60 now. Things are getting more complicated. There's things coming down the tracks, like in the last couple of years, transfer pricing rules have come in the last 10 years. In the next couple of years, there's VAT is going to get more complicated in that it'll have to be reported online with the digital VAT returns and digital invoices. So things are getting more complicated. I think government do realise that is. They have committed to making things a little bit more straightforward. I suppose last year they brought in the rules with the participation exemption on dividends, and this year they've committed to looking at the interest relief and making things a little bit more straightforward there. So those things like that will be welcome to see. With the things are becoming more complicated. So I think simplifying the tax system and making it easier for people to understand it. For SMEs, I think particularly it will make things a lot more straightforward. Things around succession planning can be a bit more straightforward. The EIS relief and various reliefs, which businesses rely on. If they can make things a bit more straightforward, I think it'd be really useful.
Brian Kelly, Taxation Partner with Fitzgerald Power, and Lisa Cantillon, CEO with KTA Tax. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Great.